Hi, everyone. My name is Ileana Rodriguez, and my project was around obesity intervention in Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders with the goal to increase fruit and vegetable consumption. So we'll get started first with talking about the target population. So Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander is usually seen as an acronym as NHOPI. Sometimes they omit the O and it's just Pacific Islanders. So you'll see NHPI utilized very frequently. Originally, when I started this project, I wanted to specifically look at the Samoan population, but there really isn't a lot of very specific research or studies or interventions done just to that particular group. So you're typically grouped in this NHOPI kind of framework. So the three major geographical areas that make up the Pacific Islands are seen here: Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and then oftentimes you have migration to Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. So those three major geographical areas, Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, include New Zealand, Hawaii, Easter Islands, Tonga, Samoa, America Samoa, the Cook Islands, and a couple of others that are listed here. Most of those are considered low to middle income areas, with the exception of New Zealand and the United States. The islands themselves house about 2.5 million people. So obesity is extremely prevalent in these areas. It's actually one of the highest in the world. And so it's also seen not just within the islands, but even among the migrant populations that head to New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Oftentimes, people carry their culture with them, and that includes cultural foods and behaviors. So, like I said, the incidence is higher than other places in the world. It's the highest in Samoan and Tongan populations. And risk factors for obesity or risk behaviors are widely studied, and they include nutritional decisions, so eating high fat, high calorie foods, cultural foods, sedentary lifestyle, genetics in some cases, and certain medicines. So based on this, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about trying to have an intervention for obesity, but I chose increasing fruit and vegetable consumption. So on average, in some studies that were done within this target population, they found that people were eating about less than 1 serving to 1.3 servings of vegetables per day. And in that particular study, 99% of the people who participated were eating less than the recommended 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. There's a lot of things that go into this, especially when it comes to the way that islands are structured, especially when it comes to food. In particular, if you look at places like Guam and Samoa, they have 80 to 100% of their foods being imported now, where traditionally these islands were eating fresh fish, taro, yams, indigenous fruits and vegetables, and so more complex carbs. And now with globalization and westernization, you're seeing a higher incidence of people eating really processed foods that are not nutritionally dense and lead to obesity. So the goal is to increase that fruit and vegetable consumption with that cultural lens, right? And understanding that there are very, very traditional foods that require this, these indigenous fruits and vegetables. And so that's what the focus is going to be. So speaking of cultural pieces that go into this, one of the big pieces within this particular population, so Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, there are different perspectives and perceptions on what a body norm is here. So traditionally, a larger body size has been attributed to health, wealth, and status on the islands, and it has continued to be that way. So one example in one article that I read, they called out that a woman can be both beautiful and fat if she's adorned properly, wearing a flower behind her ear, well-tailored clothing, and or attractive jewelry. Adorning the body supersedes any potential negative meanings associated with fatness. along with that, that article also went on to talk about other cultural pieces, like how after a woman is married on these islands, it can almost seem inappropriate for her to then go out and exercise, because it can feel like, why are you trying to lose weight or exercise? You're bringing unwarranted attention to yourself from other men. You're already married. So there's a lot that goes into why these norms are there and how that affects their perception of risk when it comes to obesity. So, or like the negative impact of obesity. So, because they value this larger body size, they often have less incentive to then lose weight and are more likely to underestimate their risk for disease. And along with that, because obesity is so prevalent and diabetes is therefore also very prevalent, and there's been so many interventions, there's also this feeling that some of it is genetic and it's inevitable, and that further limits self-efficacy, and it's something that needs to be considered when planning interventions. So I'm going to go into some of the literature review that I did. So these are articles that I read. I'm not going to get super, super detailed, but one of the things that got called out was that a lot of these interventions that have been done are at the individual level. And so one article called out that it is frequently acknowledged that it's difficult for one person to change their eating patterns within the context of extended family. This would support the idea that food and exercise recommendations would be better targeted in one, I might pronounce this wrong, Wanau, or community context. So they're advocating for really looking at community-based intervention rather than individual level, and then also looking at policy. So calling out that policy should be the focus of interventions to limit the import of overly processed foods and children's exposure to fast food advertising rather than just promoting healthy eating, because again, there have been a lot of interventions and none of them have really been successful, and they've all been really based on increasing like knowledge around healthy eating, but not really addressing it at a community level or at a policy level. Another article that I looked at that I thought had value when it comes to looking at theories was applying social cognitive theory to develop targeted messages, college students, and physical activity. So this did not specifically just look at the Pacific Islander population, and that also is one of the things that seems to be missing here, because a lot of times we're trying to apply Western interventions to a very culturally dynamic area. So this particular article talks about how they utilize social cognitive theory constructs like self-comparison, perceived threat, weight concern, exercise attitude, and perceived similarities. And they found that there was influence there. So I felt it was important because it does show that there is value to looking at social norms and influence spheres when it comes to developing interventions. The other article that I looked at was a sociocognitive review of healthy eating programs in Australian Indigenous communities. And so they looked at Australian Indigenous persons, narrowing it down to 7 studies, but really only one of them used social cognitive theory. What they found was that it's that influence piece. So that was part of the article, but what I thought was the most interesting was they called out that Western theories may not produce that understanding or action most appropriate for Indigenous communities, and researchers should seek to integrate Indigenous worldviews and privilege the voices, experiences, and lives of Indigenous people. So, Indigenous Australian persons are very similar to Pacific Islanders in that they have also seen a big influx of Western ideals, especially around food. And so it's important to consider those cultural differences when creating interventions. Another article that I looked at was Healthy Choice Rewards, a feasibility trial of incentives to influence consumer food choices in remote Australian Aboriginal community. So this was a particular intervention that utilized a $10 voucher to try to increase the consumption of fruits and vegetables. It used the trans-theoretical model of behavior change and had different stages in some of the questions that they asked. It was not particularly successful. The $10 was not deemed to be enough to make a difference in the buying habits of the people who were making these purchases. But there are a lot of really good nuggets within this article as far as like who is making those purchases. Is it the matriarch? And then even some of the responses from the participants were valuable. So for example, one person said, like you remind kids, don't do that. It's good to remind us Aboriginal people to eat more fruits and vegetables because sometimes we forget. And so that goes back to the importance of health literacy and the importance of providing information around nutritious eating. But it also gave a lot of insight to, if you want to make an impact at that level, you do have to look at the socioeconomic status of the location and see what's actually going to make a difference for that community. Because in this case, and because it's an island and a lot of things are imported, it tends to drive up the cost of food. And so if you do something like this, it has to be an impactful amount. Lastly, I looked at a particular study actually in the United States. So this was diabetes prevention for Pacific people in the United States, a mixed methods feasibility study to adapt the diabetes prevention program with Samoan Tongan church communities. So this looked at a specific church, and it was very specific to a small community. They did utilize questions that mirrored the trans-theoretical model of change. So asked about what stage they were in using Likert scale questions. So I plan to eat these vegetables. I will try to eat this many vegetables. How likely are you to eat healthily in the next 2 weeks? And so while it was also not very successful in driving weight loss or the consumption of fruits and vegetables, it did give good insight on like where to see where these interventions can happen. So for example, in this case within Pacific Islander communities, church is a really big driver of influence, right? And it's a meeting place, it's a community meeting ground. And so in this case, it was very beneficial for them to go to where people are, right? So I thought that that was really important for planned interventions and just making sure that you're looking at what's culturally significant to that particular population. And fun fact, this is the actual church that was used in the study, and it's actually where I live. So it's a little something in there. All right, moving on to my ideal intervention. So there was a lot going on in the interventions that have happened, and there have been a plethora of them. They have not been successful. You continue to see rates of obesity rise within this population. But some of the things that I did learn just in reading those was that it can't just be at the individual level, and it really needs to be comprehensive of a lot of different factors. So at the individual level, absolutely. I was looking at theory of planned behavior. And so helping the population understand and elevate their perceived risk, elevate their self-efficacy. I'm going to get into this when we get into the ethical pieces, but there is a sense of fatalism that has really become pervasive within the community as far as, is there anything you can even do when it comes to obesity? And then that perceived behavioral control and the pieces that come with that as far as, can you afford fruits and vegetables? Is that something that that's accessible to you, right? At the community level, I also think it's important, like I said, with the Long Beach study, to go to places where people are and where there's spheres of influence, right? So within the church, seeking that community support, looking at family structure and making sure that your intervention is not just focused on teaching one person, hey, you should eat fruits and vegetables, but getting the entire family involved, because a lot of times, especially for them, because of the culture, eating is very family style, right? Like it's a big deal within group settings and even at home, like they eat together. And so if one person is trying to eat more fruits and vegetables, but the rest of the family is not on board, it makes it all that more difficult. So the intervention that I would plan would hit both of those areas. And that would also work through that social influence and the subjective norms piece. So one really cool piece or reference piece that I found was the specific guidelines for healthy living. And so this is what I would use within that intervention to really guide what it is that we want to suggest or provide knowledge about to the NHPI group. And so this guide was created specifically around traditional and cultural foods. And so where a different type of guide that's more Western based might say, hey, eat broccoli, eat kale, this one will talk about, hey, like you can put taro into these types of food, or these are the foods that are native to your area that are more accessible than something that's imported. So I would use this particular guidebook as the guidelines that we would be sharing to the community through those like community-based areas like church. The last piece is the importance of mobilizing the community to also change policy. So a lot of the interventions that have already happened have been around this increasing knowledge of like what you should be eating and what you should not be eating. But as Rodriguez mentioned in one of her articles, policy also needs to be changed. And so they called out that reducing the influence of imported foods and how often those are seen in advertisements for children, or how much is imported, that needs to come from community mobilization. If you teach the community, hey, this is what you should be eating, and these are the things that are influencing your kids to then also be obese in adulthood, you can then have that call to action to get them to be the ones who advocate for themselves within the community to change that policy, reaching out to their local officials or whatever the structure might be on that particular island or location. One of the great things that I think the specific guidelines for healthy living called out, it says the guidelines for healthy living are designed to be culturally acceptable to all Pacific countries and relevant for the general healthy population. They emphasize a holistic approach to healthy living, promotion by integrating diet, consumption of locally grown and produce foods, physical activity, and other lifestyle factors such as tobacco smoking and use of alcohol. So I just thought that it was such a great resource because it is culturally relevant to the individual or the target population. So lastly, I do want to talk about ethical implications. So one of the things that that was found, because there have been so many interventions within these communities and this for this population, is that there have been unintended consequences to that. And so one of these has been an increased sense of fatalism. And so what that means is that you have certain people within this community who really feel like it's inevitable. And so that limits your self-efficacy and your perceived behavioral control, because, and this goes down to like even the way that interventions have talked about it, like, hey, like, you have a higher risk because you're obese to get diabetes, right? And so at some point, it really just became that it seems inevitable, and so you can't change it. And so they interviewed some people who, one person said, it's just how it is for us polys, it's in the genes, we die early from diabetes. And it's kind of like, that's it. Like, and there really isn't anything that you can do. You just wait for it to happen. And while that's incredibly sad, it's also something that needs to be looked at when it comes to planning interventions, because you also have to look at how are you going to reverse that? And how are you going to tailor your messaging so that it doesn't continue to perpetuate that feeling of, hey, genetically, I'm more predisposed to getting diabetes or being obese. And so those are things that I think need to be really considered. The other piece that I think has an ethical implication here is how those interventions have also started to reshape cultural norms around body size. So where, as I mentioned before, traditionally a larger body size is what's ideal within these islands, places like Fiji and Tonga have also seen changes, right? So changes that are more compatible with Western ideals as far as what body shapes should be. And so one study found that in Fiji and Tonga, the body ideals have actually moved to not being too slim, but still being very muscular. So being large, strong, but healthy. And so it seems almost contradictory and very difficult to achieve. And that comes with the interventions pushing that, hey, your body shape or size as it is in this at this BMI index that's categorizing you as obese or overweight is also no longer compatible with the cultural norm. And so it's starting to change and shift. And so because of that, there's been a rise in eating disorders, yo-yo dieting, reported stress about eating, fear of diet-related non-communicable diseases, and concerns about having a larger body size. So those are things that I don't think were intended when the group or person or organization implemented interventions, but because there has been a plethora of them, because there's influence from the Western kind of body ideal, it's created this unintended consequence of also shifting culture within the place. And so I think that that's something that needs to be considered when an intervention is created, again, through messaging and just being cognizant of it. So I think that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to seeing everyone else's.